The North Atlantic in 1943 was a place where the weather could lean on you like a fist. From the steel decks of the submarines to the thin aluminum skins of patrol bombers, everything groaned under the weight of wind and salt. The sea had a voice, low, relentless, and men learned to listen to it. But on a certain day in the late spring of that year, it wasn't the sea that spoke loudest. It was the rattle of Brownings, the shriek of falling depth charges, and the brutal shock of a plan that met its reckoning in the clear, cold light of day. This is the story of 15 minutes. 15 minutes that began like any other Atlantic patrol and ended with 8 U-boats erased from the surface, their commanders forced to choose between the sky above and the black below. The hunters had become the hunted, and the men who flew the liberators, long-range sentinels of the western approaches, had arrived not to search, but to strike. By the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had stretched into its 4th grinding year. The U-boats had prowled the convoy lanes with a confidence sharpened by early victory. Wolf packs formed like bruises on the map, coordinated at night, dispersed by day, and then reformed again with ruthless precision. But the ocean changes even when it looks the same, and the war had changed too. What the submarines could not see, the Allies began to feel. Bearing through the clouds on long wings, the Liberator, with its cavernous range and radar nose, could range far beyond the reach of the corvettes and destroyers. It did not need flat seas or perfect light. It needed a contact, a course, a sliver of a wake. It needed one chink in the U-boat routine. That was enough. The sea that day wore a hard glaze, sun flashing like broken glass upon the whitecaps. Visibility ran long. A thin shelf of cloud hugged the horizon to the west. The swell was unforgiving but honest. The submarines liked this kind of day. The air was clean. The diesel exhaust drifted off on a steady wind, and any ripple in the wake could be fought with the helm. They were on the surface to cover distance, to charge batteries, to breathe without filters. They were a convoy of shadows, 8 boats, scattered but connected, strung along a rough line like dark punctuation marks on the blank page of the ocean. The convoy commander, a man seasoned by too many nights at periscope depth, had grown tired of guessing. He had charts that showed where convoys should be, estimates of where they might be, and the faintly comforting arithmetic of endurance and speed. But the truth could be brutal. Sometimes you found the enemy precisely because the enemy was already looking for you. He ordered his boats to run surfaced for speed, to hold a flexible line abreast, to maintain radio silence except for brief coded bursts, and to conserve their torpedoes. The idea was simple and, in itself, not foolish. Spread the net, move fast, then converge. The risk lay not in the idea, but in the sky. Far to the north and west, a B-24 Liberator drifted along a patrol line that had seen everything from empty waves to burning oil slicks. 4 engines held a steady song, the crew moving in a practiced rhythm. They had been out for hours, the sea below a vast board, their eyes and instruments the pieces on it. The operator watched his scopes with a patient intensity. The navigator worked his fixes and rechecks. The pilot leaned into the horizon the way a man leans into a problem he knows he'll solve if he doesn't look away. They were not alone up there. Across hundreds of miles, other eyes searched from other aircraft. Some RAF Coastal Command, some U.S. Navy, some flying out of lonely aerodromes where the wind never seemed to stop. The Atlantic had acquired a ceiling, and the ceiling was watching. The first sign that something was different came as a thin echo on the airwaves. A burst, clipped short, almost nothing at all. Later, when the dust had settled, men would argue about exactly who picked up what and when. But in that moment, the fact of the matter was simple. A curved line of probability sharpened into direction, and direction sharpened into a patrol leg. The Liberator dipped a wing. The pilot didn't need to be told to change course. He could feel the aircraft tighten as if it had turned its head toward prey. On the intercom, voices were calm. They were always calm at this stage, calm as a rope men hold on to when the drop begins. Below, the U-boats ran. Diesel throats cleared, and propellers bit the water with the steady determination of machines that don't know fear. The commanders stood in their conning towers, binoculars up. They scanned for the broken shape that meant a destroyer's bow or the whisper of a mast. The sky, to them, was a hard blue dome. It was not their element, but they had made their peace with it, or thought they had. The sea compresses distance in a deceitful way. What is far appears near. What is near can be gone in a heartbeat. The first sight of the Liberator was a fleck against that dome, smaller than a gull at first glance. Then it grew. Then it became many things at once. A profile resolving into intent, a glint of sun off metal, a shadow sliding across the water. The commander on one of the central boats, the one that would be marked later as the keystone of the formation, called for readiness. Men moved as if the deck itself had shifted under them. They had drilled this. The 20mm gunners turned their weapons toward the growing silhouette. The deck crew barked through their checklists. The helmsman felt the commander's hand rest lightly on the rail, steady as a keel. Orders came crisp and clipped. Hold course. Prepare to turn into the attack at the last moment. Keep the profile low. Be ready to dive. But diving was not quick. Not when men were on the bridge. Not when the sea had a mind to keep you. The commander knew this. He also knew that if they scattered, they might survive, and if they stayed, they might strike together later. Wolf packs survive by being many. The sky kills the many one at a time. The Liberator leveled out in approach. The speed bled down into purpose. Communication inside the aircraft tightened again. Very few words now. A run like this is part memory, part muscle. The pilot held the aircraft just above the sea, the nose steady, the horizon a hard line. The gunners were ready. The bomb aimer's world shrank to a narrow window and a set of trajectories that existed only for a moment and then were gone. There is a particular violence to the beginning of an attack run. It is not the loudest part. It is the part where the world seems to pause right before it is torn open. The Liberator came in low, the wind carving past the fuselage, spray reaching for the belly of the aircraft. The U-boat turned into the attack, showing the smallest possible target. The conning tower bristling, men now crouched or prone. The helmsman fighting the wheel as if he could pull the ocean itself into a different shape. The first burst from the Liberator's guns walked across the bridge in a jagged line. Metal spat sparks. Paint leapt away in curls. A gunner on the U-boat fell without ceremony. Another ducked and then rose again because there was no other choice. The air around the tower thickened with smoke and fragments, the smell of hot metal cutting through the salt. Depth charges tumbled, fins catching the air. The geometry of their fall invisible except to the man who had released them. The Liberator roared overhead, the sea grabbing at its wake. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the water rose, first a shove, then a detonation that folded the surface into a blossoming wound. The U-boat heaved. Plates flexed. Bolts screamed. A wave of air forced itself through compartments, ruthless as a fist. Somewhere deep, a light went out. Somewhere else, a light came on. Men scrambled to seal what must be sealed. The commander, soaked now with the sea that had leapt up to claim him, barked the order to dive. But a dive is not a button. It is a sequence. Valves must open. Tanks must flood. The bow must yield to weight. The stern must follow. The crew must hold the line against fear. In this, as in everything else, time is both enemy and currency. The boat began to go down. Another Liberator appeared, this one from the edge of the formation's vision. It had been called in, or it had been close, or it had simply been lucky. It did not matter which. It mattered that it was there, and that the sea had become suddenly very small. The second strike did not aim to finish the first target. It sought to widen the wound. A submarine to the south, slightly behind the line, was the new focus. Her commander had seen the first attack and had called for maneuver. But the ocean is a field where a turn takes time and distance. The aircraft dove through a shallow arc, guns already live, tracers stitching a line into the water, and then up, catching the tower, the forward deck, the side plating. Men flinched. Men held on. Someone shouted a bearing. And then the voice was eaten by engine noise and the metallic thunder of the aircraft as it passed. Again, the sea leapt. Another pair of depth charges sank in tight formation. The pattern was not perfect. Patterns rarely are. But the blast caught the boat as it tried to submerge, and the shock shook loose what the sea had gripped. The U-boat's bow dipped and then rose again. Indecisive now, the ballast not yet balanced, the crew's breath thrown back at them by the concussion. The convoy commander had a problem that did not have a clean solution. Radio silence was doctrine. Survival demanded flexibility. He had to decide whether to coordinate or to vanish. Vanishing meant each boat fought its own war. Coordinating meant a whisper on the air that could call help as easily as it brought death. He made his choice. A brief burst, nothing more than a handful of seconds, cracked across the ether. It was a signal to scatter on a heading, a promise to reassemble later when the sky was blind again. The message did not need to be long, it needed to be clear. Then the transmitter went dead, and the commander watched the wake tear itself apart as his helmsman drove the boat into a hard turn. Up above, the Liberator's operator caught the change, another piece in a jigsaw that didn't reveal the picture until too late. Reports were sent, beams of intention swung like searchlights. Somewhere further out, other aircraft altered course. The ceiling lowered over the wolf pack. Minute 1. The first U-boat, wounded but diving, claws for depth. The crew braces for the second blast that might not come. The commander knows that if they make it below the thermal layer, the world above will forget them for a time. He also knows the hull has a new voice, one that complains in a way it did not before. Minute 2. The second boat heaves under the slap of the ocean. Engines fighting the change in ballast. Men on deck stumble. One goes down and does not get up. The remaining crew vanishes below in a practiced cascade, the hatch clanging shut with a sound that cannot be mistaken for anything but finality. Minute 3. The third boat, further out on the line, sees the pattern now. The commander does not wait. He calls for immediate dive, even though the batteries are not yet where he wants them, even though the sea will make his descent a bruising, uneven thing. He would rather be blind below than a target above. Minute 4. The lead Liberator circles, eyes scanning for air gunners still alive, for deck guns still turning, for the next best angle to deny a dive. The pilot knows he cannot be everywhere at once. He also knows that he does not have to be. He has friends coming. Minute 5. Another aircraft appears, a distant dot that resolves into a shape that resolves into help. The intercom sparks with the clipped approval of men who keep their praise small to keep their focus large. They coordinate without flourishes. One calls the northernmost target. The other nods at the southern too. They do not say it, but they feel it. The sea is giving up its secrets in daylight. Minute 6. The northern boat tries a trick older than the war, turning into the sun so that a diving aircraft must fight glare. It's a good trick. It's also one that the Liberator's crew has trained to meet. The approach adjusts. The run comes in from an angle that makes the glare a lesser devil. Guns speak first. The line of tracers finds the gun mount, then the bridge. Men disappear as if snatched off the deck by an invisible hand. Minute 7. The bombs fall. The spacing is tight. The calculations are good. The sea throws up another pair of towers, white and gray, and flecked with black scraps of something that used to be paint and metal. The shock wave reaches, fingers spread, feeling for a hull, feeling for any mistake in buoyancy or trim. It finds enough. The boat staggers. The commander orders blow. The boat resists. And then, with the reluctant grace of a sinking thing, it noses down again. Minute 8. Further west, the fourth U-boat chooses a different path. It runs flat out on the surface, betting on speed and distance, trusting its gunners to keep the aircraft at bay for just long enough to put water between them. The ocean obliges with a few long swells that hide the boat for the length of a breath and then reveal it again. The Liberator rides the swells from above, indifferent, methodical. Minute 9. The run on the fleeing boat is harsher. The aircraft must commit to a longer approach, exposing itself to tracers that reach up in a frantic, lashing arc. Rounds walk across the Liberator's wing. A thin line of smoke trails for a moment and then clears as airflow and luck conspire to keep the engine alive. In the moment where doubt could enter, the pilot tightens his hands on the yoke and leans the aircraft into the only thing that makes sense. Forward. Minute 10. The bombs drop late, but true. The timing is a razor's edge thing, the kind of choice that does not feel heroic so much as necessary. They hit the water ahead of the submarine, and the boat dives straight into their rising fury. The blast meets the bow head-on. Steel complains in a voice that no one can ignore. The front compartments flood with an eagerness that is all physics and no mercy. Minute 11. The first U-boat, wounded but deep now, feels the world become pressure and creak. The crew moves through the routines that have saved men in the past. Locate leaks, brace bulkheads, monitor trim, keep the boat alive with the small adjustments that add up to survival. In the silence between the groans of the hull, someone murmurs a prayer they learned long before the war. Minute 12. The second Liberator rolls in on the fifth boat, one that had tried to use the wake of its neighbor to confuse the approach. It's a tactic for destroying a pattern, not an aircraft. The bombs are set too shallow, the guns too persistent. The attack strips the deck of life and function, and when the shock comes, the boat's descent is not a choice, but a concession. Minute 13, on the radio. Higher commands begin to register the scope of the engagement. Vectors are passed. Elsewhere, shipborne escorts adjust their search patterns just a fraction, because sometimes a fraction is enough. The sea, once an open chessboard, is now a crowded table. Minute 14. The sixth boat's commander makes a decision that will divide opinions for years among those who study such things. He orders full reverse to swing the stern into the oncoming aircraft's approach, presenting the tail and the smallest possible exposed length. It works for a heartbeat. Then the aircraft slides off the line and the guns rake the tower again. Decisions in war are judged by outcomes, not intentions. Minute 15. The sky is busy now. There is smoke above the waves where there was none before. There is debris on the water that did not exist. The pilots keep their runs clean. The gunners their arcs disciplined. Below, more hatches slam. More orders are shouted into the booming silence of diesel engines that have suddenly gone quiet as the boats slip under the line of sight. 15 minutes can be forever. 15 minutes can be a single breath. For the men who lived them under the screaming sky, they were both. When suddenly, the noise stepped back. What remained was the sea and the tally that nobody wanted to count yet. Some boats were gone so completely that the ocean looked untouched where they had been. No oil, no wreckage, just the suggestion of change in the chop. Others left a trail that told a story in black stains and floating scraps. A few had made it down, their fates deferred, their crews locked in a new war of silence, valves, and pressure. Up above, the liberators did not celebrate. They circled, they watched, and they prepared to strike again if the water yielded any sign of a periscope or a conning tower's betraying shadow. Their work was not measured in moments of triumph, but in hours of endurance. Their chests hurt from breathing at altitude and then low. Their eyes burned. Their hands shook just enough to remind them that they were human. Inside a wounded submarine, the air becomes a negotiation between panic and procedure. Men move through compartments like blood through arteries, bringing life to where it's failing, sealing off what's already dead. Voices are low and quick. There is always someone with a pencil and a pad, marking down readings that mean everything if you know how to read them. Depth, angle, pressure, charge. The boat feels smaller now. Even the steel seems to listen. A petty officer kneels in brine and oil, his shoulder shoved hard against a seam that has decided it will not hold without his help. He prays the boat doesn't ask him to carry it alone. A machinist wipes his hands on a rag that used to be a shirt and smiles without humor at a gauge that looks a little better than it did a minute ago. The commander moves through it all, not with calm. Calm is a rumor no one believes at a time like this, but with purpose. Purpose is louder than fear when you let it be. The sea surface, for all its vastness, had become the size of a village square. The liberators kept station, trading altitude for visibility, speed for steadiness. Once, a spout of oil punched up from below, dark as guilt. The crew of one aircraft banked, eyes hard. They waited for the telltale marker that might become a target. Nothing else broke. The ocean, insulted and injured, closed its mouth. Communications carried the news outward in widening circles. Somewhere in an operations room, a clerk wrote the time carefully and underlined it. Somewhere else, a commander stared at a map and understood that a line had moved. Maybe not much, but enough that men could feel it when they ran their fingers along it. The night would still be dangerous. Convoys would still scatter and reform, and ships would still burn. But the sky had announced itself as a sovereign over the day, and the U-boats would have to treat it as such. What happened in these 15 minutes did not exist in isolation. It was the outcome of years of innovation and attrition, radar that saw farther and better, tactics that used that sight, patrol ranges that no longer left safe havens, code breaking that turned whispers into maps. On the other side, submarine crews who had adapted and endured, who had redefined courage in the cramped spaces between steel and sea, but who could not change the shape of daylight. In the months to come, orders would shift. Submarines would be told to avoid the surface in daylight whenever it could be helped, to cross dangerous zones submerged even if it meant crawling, to accept the punishment of slow endurance rather than the fatal promise of speed. New devices would appear, snorkels, better anti-air guns, sharper doctrine, but the tide had begun its turn. War is a ledger that can never be balanced by numbers alone. The 8 boats were not just marks on a chart. They were crews with faces and routines, jokes and grudges, letters half-written. The aircraft were not just silhouettes. They were teams bound by trust. Coffee that had gone cold in the cup holder. Boots that never quite dried between missions. When metal meets ocean at high speed, when explosives do the arithmetic of shock, the debt is paid by both sides in ways statistics cannot show. And yet, within the ledger, there are truths. One of them is this: command decisions matter. On the day that the wolf pack looked up and found the sky waiting, the commander's choice to move fast and together met an adversary that had learned to be faster and more precise. The lesson would echo beyond the wreckage, into orders and counter-orders, into the ways men slept or didn't sleep afterward. When the last echoes of the attack slid away into the long sigh of the ocean, the survivors were left with the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. Inside damaged hulls, crews counted the seconds in the flutter of gauges and the weak hum of batteries. Above, the aircraft turned for home one by one, fuel calculations asserting themselves over adrenaline. They flew back across a sea that pretended nothing had happened, because that is what the sea always does. But history does not pretend. It records, and then it asks questions. What made that quarter hour possible? Men will say radar, luck, skill, doctrine, weather, the folly of moving on the surface in daylight. Each answer is a facet. Together they make a shape, and in that shape, the truth sits quietly. By 1943, the Atlantic had begun to answer the U-boat threat with something more than hope. It answered with reach. This was the opening, a strike that tore open the day. What followed in the next phase were the desperate dives, the damaged ascents, the calculus of survival at depth, and the command decisions ashore that set the tone for the rest of the campaign. In the next part, we'll go inside the submerged fight. How the damaged U-boats tried to stabilize below the thermal layer, how the liberators coordinated further runs and called in surface support, how message traffic back to headquarters shaped the post-action orders, and how Black May turned from a phrase to a verdict. We'll also walk through individual crew perspectives, on both sides, to capture the human cost and the tactical lessons that made these 15 minutes a turning point. The North Atlantic in 1943 was a place where the weather could lean on you like a fist. From the steel decks of the submarines to the thin aluminum skins of patrol bombers, everything groaned under the weight of wind and salt. The sea had a voice, low, relentless, and men learned to listen to it. But on a certain day in the late spring of that year, it wasn't the sea that spoke loudest. It was the rattle of Brownings, the shriek of falling depth charges, and the brutal shock of a plan that met its reckoning in broad daylight. It was supposed to be a quick dash, a sprint across a patch of ocean where the sky was thin of patrols, where a synchronized surge on the surface would buy speed, endurance, and safety in numbers. Instead, it became a clockwork disaster that would unwind in 15 minutes and scatter oil, timber, and human resolve across gray water. By 1943, the Wolf had lost its midnight advantage. Radar crept into the sky on the bellies and noses of patrol aircraft. High-frequency direction finding plucked at the strings of the sea and traced voices back to their sources. Escorts grew teeth in the form of improved sonar and depth-charge throwers. On paper, the submariners weren't beaten. Men with salt in their blood rarely admit that. But the old tricks no longer held. The surface held a promise, the depths did not. Speed. A U-boat crawling on batteries was a hunted animal. A U-boat on the surface, diesels open and exhaust roaring, could sprint, regroup, and reposition. So the order was a compromise. Run by day through a gap we believe is soft. Keep together, present an awkward target. Brace for a quick dive if the sky turns hostile. It was the sort of plan that made sense when the sea seemed larger than the reach of any aircraft. The spring of 1943 made nonsense out of such comfort. Kapitän Lieutenant Rainer Koch gripped the rim of his conning tower and squinted at the horizon through salt-flecked lenses. Old salt had silvered the edges of his hair earlier than it should have, but he wore it like a rank. His boat, U-412, rode easily enough, swaying over the long shoulders of swells, diesels beating time beneath his boots. To port and starboard, a loose echelon of gray shapes breathed exhaust into the cold air. 7 other boats, their deck guns lashed, the gunners standing heads together around the flak mounts, collars turned up, eyes watering. Some smoked, some silently counted the seconds until the next check on bearing and range to their neighbors. He had protested the timing, not the plan, but the exact hour. Too much sun, he had argued, too much bright water at their backs. But the convoy they hunted had moved, and the gap in coverage was rumored, not charted. When the signal came down, he'd folded the protest into his pocket and saluted. Men who argued past the moment orders were given did not last. "Steady," he said, lowering the binoculars. His voice carried down the open hatch. "Keep the spacing. No radio unless we have to." It was the sort of counsel that kept you alive. A second longer without a transmission was a second. Longer without an invisible finger pointing from the ionosphere to your position, 100 miles away. The sky turned. Flight Lieutenant Jack Moran flew as if the Atlantic were a big room and he needed to cross it without touching the floor. He had an easy smile on land and a hard focus in the air, and he had learned to feel wind over aluminum like a pianist feels weight in the fingers. The Liberator at his command wore dull camouflage and a shark-mouthed grin of chipped paint beneath its nose turret. The crew had given it a name they didn't say too loudly. Not out of superstition, but out of a quiet affection. Planes had a way of proving you right or wrong about the names you gave them. The North Atlantic Patrol had its rhythm. Take off in half-light, climb through bruise-colored cloud. Level out into a sky that seems empty until it isn't. Then the long legs, grids drawn on maps, fuel calculations done so often they settled into muscle memory, mugs of tea cooling until the first call came from the set. "Contact," said Elsie Graves, the radar operator, her voice steady over the intercom. She had eyes that missed nothing, and a hand that kept pace with a machine that wanted to run. Multiple returns, 10 o'clock, range decreasing. "They're clustered. Could be weather, but no, that's clean. High contrast. It's a group." Moran glanced to his right. His co-pilot, Benny Hall, tilted his head, listening to the tone of Graves's voice more than her words. "Group on the surface?" Benny asked. "During the day?" The navigator Mackenzie already had the pencil out. "If those returns are where they look, they're west of the lane, heading south by west. If it's a wolf pack on the surface, they're trying to pivot." Moran pressed the intercom button, voice tightening. "Graves, mark range. 18 miles. Strong. No jamming. They're not expecting company, Skipper." "Get me the signal," Moran said. Wireless hissed and then went taut. A general contact report is a kind of lightning. It races ahead of the storm. Somewhere farther out, another Liberator crew bent over their instruments. Somewhere closer, a short Sunderland lumbered in the same air mass like a heron over a pond. But on this day, speed belonged to the B-24s. Sleek for their size, bristling with 50 caliber guns, fat-bellied with ordnance set shallow to bite just below a hull's skin. Patrol bombers had become sharp instruments. "Stand by to run in hot," Moran said. "No lights. We stay low. We come in from the sun as much as we can find in this place." There was little sun, only a thin brightness breaking through rags of cloud. It would have to do. They dropped to mast height, waves rushing by in streaks. The fuselage hummed. Props bit and chewed the air. Men checked harnesses. The front turret swung. The belly gunner swung with it. Ammunition belts lay like sleeping serpents along their tracks. 8, 9 contacts, Graves said a minute later, breath catching the slightest bit. "This is a herd." Moran didn't answer. He was already in that space where thinking collapses into action, where everything you know is weight behind your hands and feet. For a moment, distance held them in separate worlds. Koch's men stood in pea coats and wool, watching the light squirm on the surface of the water and thinking about lunch. The smell of boiled coffee came up from the galley and ran nose to nose with the bow wave's cold perfume. Someone cracked a joke about Iceland being a rumor invented by navigators. Then a glimmer at the horizon refused to be ordinary. A flick of reflection at 4 o'clock. A suggestion of geometry where sea should be soft. Koch's glasses came up as if yanked. A flare of sunlight caught a shape that wasn't a wave, and his stomach agreed with his eyes before his brain caught up. "Aircraft," he said. The shout traveled. "Aircraft! Starboard! Man the guns! Prepare to dive. Hold for my mark. On U-4.1's winter garden, the twin 20mm mounts woke with a spitting cough as crews hunched and swung them around, stripping covers off ammunition. The angle was poor. The men were better. Training patched the gap. Across the loose formation, heads snapped. Orders flew down hatches. Some boats pivoted a hair to present a more difficult target. Others stayed stubbornly on line, a mistake born of habit. The sea became littered with suddenly moving parts. The quick scramble of men, the thunk-tunk of hatches being dogged, the metallic prayer spoken by hands on steel. The Liberator came in like a train through fog. Its engines filled the air. Its belly was black against the light. Tracers stitched the water, underscoring the sound with bright punctuation. Behind it, clee-clee, the call of another plane's guns. A second B-24 had taken the vector and was running a slightly high line in. Farther out, a third turned its nose. Moran felt the air thicken as he skimmed the chop, the wake from his own passage spitting spray. "Guns free," he said calmly. "Set charges shallow. We keep them on the surface. We don't let them slip. Pick the lead boat first, then the straggler." "Lead boat acquired," the nose gunner said. "Range 300. 250! Now," Moran said, and the forward guns spoke. The first seconds were noise and light. 50-caliber rounds tore across conning towers and slammed into flak shields, chewing at metal and men. A gunner on Coke's starboard mount lifted off his feet in a hiss of vapor and smoke. The man behind him shoved the body aside by instinct, thumbs pressing down on paddles that made the metal bark. Tracer reached up, luminous tooth and nail, and rattled off the Liberator's belly in little outbursts of black. The bomber jolted. It did not lift off target. "Steady," Moran said through clenched teeth. "Steady!" The first stick of depth charges leaped from the bomber's bay and dropped like stones, each one armed to explode just below the surface, where a hull runs fat with ballast and pride. They entered the water evenly spaced, a row of blind teeth biting down. Coke watched them with a peculiar clarity, counting as if counting could slow time. "Crash dive," he shouted now. Enough was enough. "Crash dive now. All ahead. Bow planes." The hatch scissored shut over his head. He slid down the ladder into the conning space, one shoulder hitting a rung hard enough to bruise. Men moved past each other with the perfect improvised choreography of panic. Bowplanes bit water. Tanks blew. U-412 angled. The charges went off with a violence that erased thought. Water heaved. Debris leapt. A second boat farther out caught a shock that peeled plates and turned welds into ideas. Men on deck who hadn't made it below became part of the sea in an instant too complex to narrate and too simple to misunderstand. In the Liberator, the blast came up through the frame, through steel and wood and bone. Benny swore. Moran rode the heave and dipped a wing slightly to clear the column of water. "We're good," he said, as much to himself as anyone. "Oil on the water," the belly gunner said. "Big patch, she's hurt bad." A second B-24, swinging in at an angle to rake the trailing boats, took the opportunity. Its pilot, a cautious man on most days, set caution aside. He dropped into the slot between two towers, guns hammering. One of the U-boats tried to bring its stern around, twin cannons snickering. The plane's rounds found people and metal indistinctly. The result was the same. "Second stick away," came the calm voice from the bombardier's position on Moran's plane. "Shallow again?" "On the straggler." They were not bombing so much as sowing. Charges entered the water along the imagined path of a boat, trying to slide under a table with its back to the wall. The timing was cruel and expert. Catch them just as the deck goes under, when the boat can neither fight on the surface nor hide below. Water doesn't carry voices well, but it carries force, and it carried the second set of impacts to the hull of U-412 as a rush of chaos. Coke threw an arm over the plotting table as lights blew out and came back in a stuttering dim orange. Gauges danced like frightened birds. "Report!" he yelled, though he already knew the answers. The boat groaned. The forward compartment sang with a high, metallic keening, the sound of something both broken and still trying to do its job. "Flooding in the forward torpedo room," someone shouted. "We're holding for now. Dive angle, 5 degrees, 7, level us," Coke snapped. "Blow aft. Keep her nose." He didn't finish. The hull lifted with a percussive shudder as another charge went, somewhere too close for comfort. Men looked at one another with wide whites around their irises. A few had the grace to swallow before cursing. One crossed himself without thinking, and then looked around, embarrassed, as if modesty still mattered. On the surface, one of the boats had stayed up a hair too long, its captain gambling that he could keep his gunners engaged and discourage the next run. It was a bad bet. The second Liberator's forward guns walked their way from bow to conning tower to the knot of men around the 20mm mounts, and then the belly door puckered open and let fall bright, ugly shapes that churned the surface down its starboard side.